everybody, welcome back to my channel, The Medieval Reader. In March, I and a few other people, notably Elena Makridina and Anna at Anna Babbling Books, I believe that's her channel name, I will link both channels below, will be reading Orlando Furioso by Ariosto, which was first published in 1516. It is an epic of the Italian Renaissance. I think it is a parody of courtly romance, but I might be completely wrong. But today I thought I'd make a video about reading pre-modern and early modern texts, especially since BookTube mostly focuses on recent releases. I also think that the approach that most booktubers take to modern books is not necessarily the best approach to take to reading early and pre-modern texts. So that's why I'm making this video today. A little over a year ago, Adam at Memento Mori hosted a read-along of Boccaccio's Decameron. So the Decameron was written in the 14th century by this Florentine, Boccaccio, and it's a collection of tales. This read-along particularly came to mind because I am currently reading the Decameron for one of my classes on Renaissance literature. Near the end of the read-along, Eric Carl Anderson made a video called How Should We Read the Classics? I will link it below, where he expressed his frustration about problematic content in the Decameron. And in general, his frustration about misogyny, homophobia, racism, etc. Found in books that we consider the classics. And then there's Aaron Hanlon, an academic whose Twitter account I follow, who recently posted a thread about his experience being a literature scholar and the assumption that people make that if you are studying literature, then you're necessarily an enthusiast of the particular author who you work on or the book that you're working on. So that you are passionate about your research and champion the book that you're reading. Now, while the first might be true, you might be very passionate about what you're working on, the second may not be the case. You may not be enthusiastic about what you're reading, even if you are passionate about the research that you're doing. Here's what Aaron Hanlon has to say about the assumption people make about literature scholars. And I think this is an assumption that booktubers tend to make, at least based on the videos that I've been seeing and the conversations that we've had on BookTube. So here is what Hanlon says. Why is it that people in various science and social science fields see themselves as dispassionate, objective, etc., and yet expect scholars of history, literature, culture, etc., to be enthusiasts? Why should we be? Why would anyone have such a ludicrous expectation? Let me be clear, I'm not talking about love or enthusiasm for our work. I do love my work. I'm talking about the expectation that we love our objects of study, that we revere them, that we exist to affirm their greatness, that our work is a kind of hagiography of the thing. My conjecture is that the layperson's experience with and tendency to study literature, history, etc. basically ends in grade school, where arts and culture and English education is weighted heavily on appreciation and cultural affirmation of aesthetic merit, etc. Now, I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with reading for cultural appreciation or literary merit. I obviously think that medieval and Renaissance literature can be rewarding in a positive way. I think that's quite clear if you follow my channel. I definitely would consider myself a medieval enthusiast, but not always because I am an enthusiast of the subject matter that I'm studying. So, for example, I am actually working on a Renaissance trial, early 16th century, a man who was burnt at the stake for heresy. I'm clearly not an enthusiast of inquisitorial practices, executing heretics. I'm not. And yet I find it very interesting to read these trials because they tell us a lot about law in France in the early 16th century, about orthodoxy and heresy, about early Reformation conflicts, about this man whose work I was not at all familiar with until I started reading about his trial. So these are all the reasons why I'm enthusiastic about my subject matter. But it's not because I have this great appreciation for, heresy trials and I'm like, yes, let's bring them back. No, I am certainly very critical of it. I mean, we basically take it for granted that executing people whose religious views you disagree with is wrong. But I don't think that that's necessarily the way that Booktube tends to approach literature in general, which kind of makes sense because mostly Booktube is about modern books, about recent releases, and about what books are good and what books are not, based on a number of criteria. But that's not necessarily the approach that I would suggest you take for pre and early modern literature, because I think you would take more out of it if you were to acknowledge the problematic content and read these older works for more than just cultural appreciation or aesthetic merit or any of that. I don't think that you have to love the pre and early modern literature that you read to find it valuable. And I think that the star rating system that we tend to use for books, and I do too on Goodreads, I rate all of my books, can often not be very helpful when it comes to older books. So for example, I do think that reading the 11th century Song of Roland is valuable. But, what star rating should I give it? There's quite a lot of racism. It's incredibly anti-Islamic. It's got all these problems. It is, in a way, crusade propaganda. It has value because it's been cited so much, it was widely known, it was the basis of later epics. But that doesn't mean that I have to have some great cultural appreciation for the Song of Roland to find it valuable. And so Eric Carl Anderson's video is related to all of this because, he expresses frustration about having to feel like he has to like the Decameron, and I don't think he has to. Some of the stories do include rape as humor, just incredibly sexist material in general, victim blaming, all kinds of things like this. And there are a number of scholars who have written extensively about Boccaccio's view on women. And it's complicated because he also wrote a work called De Mulieribus Claris, concerning the illustrious women, where he praises women. Does that mean that that collection of tales about women, even though they are written as a praise of women, is devoid of misogyny? Not necessarily. Does that mean that that excuses all of the problematic representation in the Decameron? No. No, I think that it's important to acknowledge these elements and to sit with them and to study them as potentially revealing about the way that 14th century Italian intellectuals thought about women. Christian intellectuals thought about women. There's a lot that we can take from reading the Decameron that doesn't include just enthusiasm about the stories, because there's a lot of problematic content in it. And it's possible that there will be some of that in Orlando Furioso. I don't know, because I haven't read it, but it's very possible. So some of the responses to Eric's video were like, well, you need to read the texts, in context, you need to be aware of the time period, and this author was a product of his time. Well, yes, but that doesn't mean that we need to excuse the homophobia, misogyny, and racism. And so if the author is a product of his time, then why can't we then dig deeper and analyze what it means for him to be a product of his time? What does it mean that Boccaccio is a product of a period in which this kind of rhetoric was very common and encouraged about women, about, any group of people that are still marginalized today? What does this tell us? Can't we then maybe talk about the Decameron as evidence of the way people have thought about women and the kind of rhetoric that was used, rhetoric that might still be used today? There's a number of really valuable ways of approaching older literature that isn't just simply appreciation. I think this can be very valuable. And that's what a lot of us studying literature do. I think this is maybe the most important for those of you who are studying English literature, or in any literature. I'm working on French literature, it doesn't really matter. Because, on Booktube, yes, we read books for pleasure, and so, we might give The Song of Roland or Boccaccio or whatever 2 stars because we had a lot of problems with the content. And, that's perfectly fine, because Booktube is, whatever you want it to be. But if you are an English lit student, then maybe approaching it in this other way of not just trying to rate it based on your own pleasure, that can be valuable, and you might find that you're getting more out of your English classes that way. And I would really encourage people on Booktube to do that if they decide to participate in a read-along of an older work, or just read an older work for themselves. You might find that you take a lot more from the experience than just being frustrated and not knowing what to do with that, or feeling like you have to hide the fact that you're frustrated. I think there's this idea that you're somehow supposed to just excuse problematic content and ignore it, and not talk about it, that talking about it is a problem. No, it's not a problem. I think you're absolutely right to identify it. And I think that we can have these conversations, and that we should have these conversations. So I hope that this was helpful. Let me know if you have ever had this issue with reading older works and how you have addressed it. And I will talk to you later. Bye now.